The two of them suddenly witnessed a bizarre scene in the cabin. An odd scar appeared on the wooden plank before them. Out of curiosity, the girl gently poked the scar with a pencil, causing disgusting slime to ooze out. Determined to figure out what it was, Siobhan, a marine biologist, immediately used a spoon to scrape a sample for further study. However, Gerard, following close behind, used his hand to dig into the already corroded wooden plank. To their shock, inside was a strange, oddly shaped parasite. Drawing from his years of maritime experience, Gerard concluded it was likely a barnacle parasitizing the ship's hull. But Siobhan disagreed. To test her hypothesis, she quickly donned her diving suit and jumped into the water to investigate further. As she suspected, the creature parasitizing the ship's hull was not a barnacle but a bioluminescent tentacled entity, something Siobhan had never encountered before. She decisively pulled out a knife to separate the tentacled creature from the hull, only to find the task much harder than expected. Just as Siobhan was unsure of what to do next, more tentacled creatures appeared behind her. Realizing something was amiss, she turned around, only to be attacked by the creatures. Fortunately, Siobhan reacted quickly and escaped unharmed, but when she looked down into the ocean floor, she was horrified to see that the tentacles belonged to a massive deep-sea monster. Terrified, Siobhan rushed back to the ship and recounted everything she had seen. Hearing about the tentacles, Gerard was convinced it was a giant squid and immediately ordered the crew to prepare the nets to haul it on board. If they could bring it back, this voyage would be a massive payday for them. Siobhan, however, was worried it wasn't that simple and suggested contacting the Coast Guard for backup. But the prospect of wealth made the fishermen unwilling to give up the chance of a lifetime. What they didn't anticipate was how powerful the creature was. Despite the winch's immense pulling force, the creature didn't budge, and the ship began to tilt dangerously. To make matters worse, the monster extended more tentacles to grip the ship tightly, leaving them trapped and unable to move. Left with no choice, Gerard ordered the winch to be released, but an accident occurred. A crew member's hand got caught in the winch, and by the time his companions rescued him, his hand was mangled and bloody. Siobhan was horrified, and as she picked up the blood-stained wallet on the deck, she noticed it had somehow been coated with the same blue slime. She didn't think much of it, but when she looked up, she spotted another fishing vessel nearby. She immediately informed Gerard, who grabbed binoculars and confirmed there was indeed a larger fishing boat in the distance. However, Gerard wasn't pleased. Asking for their help would mean splitting the giant squid with them. Reluctantly, he decided they had no other choice since they couldn't capture the squid or even free themselves on their own. When they fired a flare to signal for help, the other vessel didn't respond. Left with no alternative, Gerard, Siobhan, and another crew member rowed a small boat over to investigate. Upon boarding the larger vessel, they found it completely deserted. Strangely, the radio had also been deliberately destroyed. After searching the deck to no avail, the three of them entered the cabin, where they were greeted by a horrifying sight. All the crew members were dead, and one body even had its eyes gouged out. What was even more baffling was the lack of any signs of struggle. It appeared as if they had chosen to kill themselves. Gerard speculated that the crew suffered from severe insomnia, leading to sea fever, a condition that drives people insane and suicidal. To avoid panic, Gerard sternly warned the others not to disclose what they had seen, but without outside assistance, how would they escape this part of the sea? Back on their own ship, the three were still worried, but the others brought good news. The creature had released its grip on the vessel. Gerard quickly ordered the ship to set sail and leave the area. However, not long after, the sonar detected a massive object approaching. It turned out the creature had been following them all along. Fortunately, when they retrieved the fishing nets, they had still managed to catch plenty of seafood, making the trip worthwhile. As they happily packed the seafood, Johnny, the crew member with the injured hand, began to feel unwell. That night, he became feverish and restless, with an uncontrollable urge to dive into the sea, only to be stopped in time by the others. Gerard suspected he had brought contraband on board, but Johnny denied it. Siobhan believed the fever was due to an infection in his wounded hand. Soon, Johnny also complained of discomfort in his eyes. Alarmed, Siobhan used a flashlight to examine them. To her horror, she saw a worm writhing inside his eye. Shocked by her reaction, Gerard grabbed the flashlight to take a look but found nothing unusual, accusing Siobhan of overreacting. But shortly after, Johnny's condition deteriorated further, and he suddenly lost his vision. As they questioned him, a terrifying event unfolded. Johnny's eyeballs burst open. What was even more horrifying was the blood that sprayed out. Filled with countless wriggling worms, Johnny collapsed, convulsing violently, and moments later, lay lifeless. Siobhan, shaken, released his body and was haunted by the sight of his empty eye sockets. She immediately recalled the scene she had witnessed on the other fishing vessel. It was clear that this was not just a case of sea fever but an infection caused by an unknown parasite. The parasite seemed capable of spreading through the water supply. Hearing this, the crew hurried to shut off the water valve, but Sudi, unaware, was taking a shower in the bathroom. They rushed to warn Sudi to turn off the shower head, but it was too late. The parasite had already entered Sudi's body. When they forced open the bathroom door, they found Sudi crouched on the floor, covered in blood. The situation had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectations. Siobhan hid in her room, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to believe that her simple research trip with the fishing crew had turned into such a nightmare. After Sudi's wounds were hastily bandaged, the crew gathered at the water pipes to investigate. They discovered that the filters and all the filtration systems had been completely eaten away by the parasites. Realizing the danger, Omid quickly shut off the valve at the water tank, attempting to trap the parasites inside. However, Siobhan insisted on opening the tank to confirm what kind of parasite they were dealing with, hoping to find a way to combat them. As soon as they opened the steel door, a parasite leaped out. Unfortunately, even Siobhan couldn't identify what kind of parasite it was, but she was certain that the parasites were connected to the deep-sea creature. Based on this, she theorized that the parasites might not survive in freshwater for long and could die within a few hours. To be safe, she prohibited anyone from using freshwater in the meantime. At that moment, Omid suggested they seek help from the fishing boat they had seen earlier. Gerard, however, finally confessed the truth that all the crew members on that boat were already dead. While Gerard claimed they had died of sea fever, everyone knew deep down that the parasites were to blame. The next day, Siobhan and Omid returned to the water tank to check if the parasites had died. When Omid opened the steel door, the parasites were no longer as active as they had been the day before. Believing they were dead, Siobhan quickly used a net to scoop them out. To her horror, when she lifted the net, it had been completely chewed through by the parasites. Even in their weakened state, the parasites posed a significant threat, leaving the crew with no choice but to continue waiting. That night, Siobhan recalled the blue slime sample she had collected earlier in the cabin. Upon closer examination, she was horrified to discover it was filled with tadpole-like parasite larvae. From this, Siobhan deduced that the parasites were the eggs of the giant creature. They reproduced by parasitizing other organisms, mistakenly targeting the fishing boat as their host. Because Johnny had come into contact with the slime when injured, he had been infected. The larvae entered Johnny's body through his wound. Now, they had to figure out how to kill the larvae to prevent further infections. After all, everyone on board had suffered minor injuries during the ordeal. The crew sprayed disinfectant into the pipes, but it had no effect. Siobhan, relying on her expertise, thought of using ultraviolet light. With limited resources, she tried using her phone's flashlight. While it worked to some extent, the weak UV light only killed a small number of larvae. With over 30 hours left before they reached the port, they realized that without a solution, they might all be dead by then. Desperate, Siobhan had a bold idea when she noticed the desk lamp in front of her electricity. The next morning, the crew began executing the plan. They soaked the entire ship with seawater and ran electrical wires across the deck. After setting everything up, Siobhan collected a sample to observe under a microscope and confirmed that the electric current had effectively killed the larvae. However, the crisis was far from over. Siobhan feared that someone on board might already be infected, and they had to ensure the source of the infection was completely eradicated before returning to port. If the larvae were brought back to the city, it would undoubtedly result in another disaster. As a biologist, Siobhan felt it was her duty to prevent such a catastrophe. Since Johnny's symptoms had appeared 36 hours after infection, they decided they needed to wait another 36 hours to confirm everyone's safety before docking. But the crew, eager to leave the ship, refused to comply with Siobhan's proposal. That night, Sudi's condition worsened, and he died when his eyeballs ruptured. Sudi's death only strengthened the crew's resolve to reach the port as quickly as possible. With the port growing closer, no one listened to Siobhan's warnings. Left with no choice, Siobhan secretly went to the stern and threw a rope into the sea to entangle the propeller, forcing the ship to stop. When Omid noticed the ship had stopped, he went to investigate and caught Siobhan with the rope. Realizing what she had done, Omid dragged her back to the cabin. When the others learned the truth, Sierra angrily punched Siobhan, and Freya demanded to know why she did it. Siobhan reiterated her point: someone on board might already be infected, and she wouldn't allow anyone to leave the ship until they confirmed it was safe. With no other options, the crew reluctantly agreed to cooperate. Since Johnny and Sudi had both shown worms in their eyes before their deaths, Siobhan began checking everyone's eyes one by one. The process was terrifying, for everyone finding worms would mean certain death. After checking each other, Siobhan and Omid were clear. Sierra and the other crew members also passed without issue, but when it was Gerard's turn, disaster struck. He was infected. In his despair, Gerard revealed a secret no one else knew. He had received a warning from the Coast Guard before setting sail, advising him to avoid the restricted area altogether. However, in his eagerness to fish, Gerard insisted on changing course and entering the restricted zone, which led to their peril. Upon learning the truth, Omid and Sierra were furious, but the damage was already done, and they had no choice but to accept reality. Sierra apologized to Siobhan for the punch earlier, yet her hands slowly moved toward Siobhan's neck, and her gaze suddenly turned menacing. Sensing something was wrong, Siobhan quickly pushed Sierra away and ran, only to be chased by her in a crazed frenzy. In self-defense, Siobhan fought back, and a single kick sent Sierra tumbling from a height, landing hard and dying instantly. It wasn't until she saw blue slime oozing from Sierra's eyes that Siobhan realized Sierra had been infected. She intended to tell Gerard what had happened, but she saw Freya emerge from his room in a daze. It turned out Gerard, knowing there was no hope for himself, had chosen to end his life on his own terms. Overcome with fear, Freya ignored Siobhan and Omid's attempts to stop her and boarded a lifeboat, heading toward the port alone. Now, only Siobhan and Omid were left on the ship. While dealing with the corpses, they suddenly heard a strange noise. Following the sound to the ship's hold, they discovered it was coming from the water tank. To their horror, the fresh water not only hadn't killed the larvae but had allowed them to continue growing. The two considered heating the water tank to kill the larvae, but such an idea was clearly impractical. Sure enough, when they opened the steel door, the larvae, now transformed into tentacles, were still highly active. Realizing it was no longer safe to stay, the two made a difficult decision to pour gasoline on the deck and burn the ship along with the creatures. As they ignited the ship and prepared to leave on the lifeboat, Omid, who was walking behind, accidentally fell into the sea. Knowing the creature was lurking beneath them, Siobhan immediately reached out to save him, but in the next moment, Omid was pulled down by a powerful force. Without hesitation, Siobhan dove into the water and found Omid entangled by the tentacles. With great effort, she pried the tentacles loose and managed to rescue Omid just in time. By sheer luck, as they climbed back into the lifeboat, they saw a ship approaching in the distance, likely the Coast Guard. But before they could celebrate, Siobhan noticed her arm was bleeding heavily. It was clear she had been bitten by the tentacles during the rescue. Her fate was sealed. Yet Omid tried to comfort her, assuring her that once they returned to the city, there would be a way to save her. However, determined to prevent the disaster from spreading, Siobhan had already resolved to sacrifice herself. After a tearful farewell with Omid, she decisively dove into the water, swimming toward the terrifying deep-sea creature. In the end, Omid was left sitting alone in the lifeboat. No matter how desperately he waved for help, the Coast Guard ship in the distance refused to come closer. It was clear that, to prevent the disaster from spreading further, they had no intention of conducting a rescue. Omid's fate was left to chance. With no one to save him,